In 1996, South Korea, backed by their government, saw the creation of their first handheld gaming company known as GamePark. They would eventually go on to launch their one and only product, the GeePee32, which saw revisions along the way, but the GeePee32 gained a following because of its ability to do more than just game. In fact, it was really the first open source handheld which allowed anyone to program and create software for the device. Today, most will not remember the GeePee32, and it's just a small blip on the gaming timeline. But why is this handheld more important than it seems? This is Retrospective, a series where we look at forgotten devices that were once loved, hated, famous, and infamous. It's a chance for the old to feel new and for the neglected to shine again. All are welcome here. I am Rob, the Retro Tech Dad, and join me on this episode of Retrospective. Welcome to episode 3 of Retrospective. And for me personally, this has been my most anticipated video to make, and one that I have a special connection to since I quite fondly remember being a teenager and owning one of these. Not only that, but I've been working on this episode on and off since episode 2 for many months ago, and the channel really has grown tremendously since the last retrospective episode. Long story short, this has been long overdue. The device known as the GeePee32 from a company called GamePark, and in many ways is the grandfather of all emulation handhelds. But before we start talking about the GeePee32, let's learn a little bit about the company behind the product. GamePark's story is quite fascinating, and the company was founded way back in 1996, and unlike many of the companies behind the emulation handhelds of today, GamePark was not based out of China. Instead, they were a South Korean company. Amazingly, GamePark's creation was the result of a law that was established after World War II, which did not allow for the importation of Japanese media, and as a result, that would inevitably include video games. Therefore, the South Korean market was mainly dominated by the personal computer, and companies like Nintendo did not have a presence there. Instead, companies like Sega and Nintendo opted to license out their consoles to Korean electronics giants like Samsung and Hyundai, who would go on to create variants of consoles such as the Sega Saturn and Nintendo 64. Most of these had a very small market share. It would not be until 2004 that the censorship ban on Japanese media in South Korea would finally be lifted, which resulted in the creation of Nintendo of Korea in 2006. But let's head back again 10 years prior to 1996 and focus on the South Korean government, who did not want the Japanese to have a monopoly, and they decided to fund a company that would create a games console, so a contest was held to determine the winner of government funds. As you may have guessed, GamePark emerged as the winner, and work began on a handheld product which would be the first handheld game system out of South Korea, the GeePee32. This seems like the perfect time to properly introduce the star of this episode, and rightfully so, because really, the GeePee32 was the beginning of something special that we still enjoy to this very day. The GeePee32 was in development for a few years before finally launching on November 23, 2001, and during its development went through a few revisions until finally GamePark landed on the design that we see here, very much mimicking the Game Boy Advance right down to the inclusion of the L and R shoulder buttons, 2 face buttons, and its horizontal format. Like the Game Boy Advance, the GeePee32 ran on your standard AA batteries, but despite clear influences, the GeePee32 had its own neat tricks, including a really satisfying and unique joystick that is very reminiscent of the Neo Geo Pocket Color, and used micro switches that were super clicky and sounded so good. Just take a listen to how satisfying this is. During its short lifespan, the GeePee32 went through a few revisions along the way. The original 2001 launch model was known as the NLU, which stood for No Light Unit, and much like the Game Boy Advance and prior Game Boy models, required an external light source to help see the screen. In 2002, GamePark released the FLU, which was the front light unit and provided a light source built into the handheld. Finally, in 2004, GamePark released the BLU, which stood for backlight unit, and there were actually two versions of the BLU. The other, known as the Blue Plus, which required software to handle the slight revisions of the backlit LCD screens since it wasn't 100% compatible. And it's also how I was able to identify that the current model I own is the Plus version. The GeePee32 for its time was backed by some surprisingly powerful hardware with a Samsung manufactured processor based on an ARM 920T core and could be clocked reliably to 133 MHz, which really seems even more impressive when compared to just the 16.8 MHz for the Game Boy Advance. Now, I hinted that the GeePee32 was the grandfather of emulation handhelds. But what if I told you that GamePark's goal was to create original software for the device, and the idea of emulation wasn't necessarily what it was created to do? In fact, GamePark was hoping that the platform being open source would attract more independent developers to the platform to create software and games for the handheld, and compared to Nintendo's Game Boy Advance, it was definitely a point of difference since any GeePee32 unit could be registered as a development unit. GamePark launched the GeePee32 with 5 games, all of which were unique to the handheld. The original launch games covered various genres, and most were criticized for not being particularly any good. Over the course of its lifetime, the GeePee32 would see 28 officially released commercial games that were sold traditionally in retail stores and available on encrypted smart media cards or through the internet using GamePark's online store, another fairly forward-thinking feature. Most of the original games for the GeePee32 were not particularly great, but it did have a few gems, and some of my personal favorites are really the ones that most will mention when talking about the limited exclusive library of the GeePee32. Now, it's no secret that I am a dad that loves his shmups, and so naturally one of the standout original games for the GeePee32, especially for me, was Tomak Save the Earth, a very interesting side-scrolling shoot-'em-up that I actually owned and played back in the day when I originally had the GeePee32. Amazingly, I found out that there is a PC version available of this game, and I'd say it's even more obscure than the GeePee32 release since at least on the GeePee32, it has the spotlight given the limited exclusive library of this handheld. Now, if you're curious, I do have a link to download the PC version from archive.org to make it easier for everyone, and I have personally tested it myself on Windows 11. I recommend heading to the Damon Tools website and download the Lite version, which will allow you to mount the .bin file to properly install the game. Now, another very interesting game was Blue Angelo, a very cool Metroidvania style game that to this day still remains a fully exclusive GeePee32 title. There was a planned Game Boy Advance port that was eventually cancelled, but there are some prototypes floating around but still do not represent the fully completed game. Even more interesting is that Blue Angelo was resurrected in a fairly recent Kickstarter campaign with the goal of creating a modern version of the game, which unfortunately now seems to be defunct. So despite its troubled history, Blue Angelo still remains a highlight of the GeePee32 library, and definitely well worth checking out for owners of a GeePee32. Blue Angelo is also the last physical game released for the GeePee32. Now, I happen to enjoy pinball games quite a bit and even have a virtual pinball table to allow me to enjoy this segment of gaming. However, GeePee32 had its own offering of pinball, and while this one is not necessarily unique to the GeePee32, it's still a fairly solid port of the game. It was also developed by Digital Illusions, or better known as DICE, and you probably know them for a few little games like Battlefield. Anyways, Pinball Dreams is a very cool pinball game, and if you're curious to see how this one stacks up against the other countless versions, World of Retro Gaming has a fantastic YouTube video covering all of them. So we've covered a few different genres so far, and of course, no handheld or console would be complete without at least a fighting game, and Little Wizard for the GeePee32 is certainly the one you'll want to check out if you're going down the GeePee32 rabbit hole. And for sure, the highlight of this game was the fantastic art style. Now, I wanted to show up an exclusive beat-em-up game called Her Nights, and while this one is not particularly all that great, it's still well worth mentioning. given that it is exclusive to the GP32. Like Little Wizard, I do really like the art style on display here, and I can see why I liked my GP32 so much back in the day, since it pretty much has at least one game for every genre that I enjoy quite a bit even to this day. Finally, I wanted to talk about one last exclusive game for the GP32, the Ginkgo Girl, which until more recently was something that I could not actually really enjoy since it never had an English version. As always, the awesome community stepped in, and now we have a patch for this game which fully translates this into English, and now English speakers can enjoy this game. I will have a link to the fan translation patch in the description. And of course, if you are interested, these are the 28 officially released games for the GP32 in case you are curious about the rest of the library. But if you remember, I mentioned that the GP32 was an open source handheld, which meant that anyone with the will and ability could create software for it. There was a fairly loyal and dedicated community that produced homebrews and ports like the Gianna Sisters, Quake, and Duke Nukem, again very similar to what most modern handhelds enjoy today. And yes, the GP32 played Doom. Now there was definitely standout software developed for the GP32 such as music and video players that allowed you to play back movies, and so much like the PSP would do just a few years later, the GP32 could become a full-blown multimedia device. And with great power comes emulation. It's no surprise that given we had an open source platform that all roads would lead to what the GP32 really is best known for today. Now we certainly take for granted the capabilities of modern emulation handhelds, and not only are they more capable than ever, but they are cheaper than ever before. The GP32 may not seem all that impressive today with its emulation capabilities, but remember that when this product was around way back in the early 2000s, there really wasn't anything like it. And that's not to discredit the capabilities of the GP32 since it could emulate NES, Genesis, Game Boy, and even handle some lighter Super Nintendo and Game Boy Color. Again, at the time this was unheard of, and little did I know that the teenage version of me would be enjoying what inevitably would become the grandfather of all emulation handhelds. I cannot overstate the importance of the GP32 and the foundation that it laid for all of the handhelds based around this concept that followed after it. I also have to take a moment and remind myself that 20 plus years is a long time in technology, and looking at how emulation performs on the GP32 is a bit unfair in current times, as today we have countless options for emulating on a handheld, and even the cheapest of handhelds will outperform the GP32. And while the emulation is nowhere near perfect, it's still very impressive, especially being really the first of its kind with a handheld device emulating other platforms. So one of the most important things for an obscure platform like the GP32 is being able to preserve its legacy. Thankfully, much of the software and games available for the GP32 have been properly preserved and archived. The entirety of the game library is readily available on websites like archive.org, and really nowadays the challenge is working with the older hardware. I had to track down an adapter that was capable of reading the SMC format, and of course Amazon has never failed me, and so I was able to get my smart media card loaded up with lots of goodies using this memory card adapter. However, if you don't have the actual hardware, there is an option available for Windows users if you are curious to explore some of the GP32 library. The emulator GeePee32 has been updated with version 0.44 being the latest one released back in October of 2021. Unfortunately, even with the GeePee32 emulator update, most of the games are not emulated well since most will not play with any audio. There is also a GeePee32 core for MAME, and this fares even worse since it runs very slow. Sadly, this means that for someone interested in experiencing the limited GeePee32 library, the best way to do it will still be with original hardware, which can be expensive to obtain. Now, if you are still interested, I will have a link to the GeePee32 emulator and firmware file so that you can try this out for yourself on a Windows-based PC. There's not much to it, just simply go to the website I've linked to, download the emulation and firmware zip files, and extract their contents. You will want to extract the contents of the firmware file into the system GeePee32 firmware folder. However, once extracted to this directory, you will need to rename the .bin file to fw GeePee32.157E.bin. Otherwise, you will get an error message when trying to run the emulator. Once you've renamed the firmware file, you can now launch it by running the GeePee32.exe and then loading up a game such as one in .smc format. Now, preservation does go beyond just archiving games and emulation, as the community behind the GeePee32 was quite dedicated, and thankfully a lot of the neat community aspects have been preserved, including a lot of the fan-produced magazines. I definitely recommend checking out the GeePee32 file archive, which still works and maintains lots of useful content related to the GeePee32. I also recommend saving anything you can because we really don't know for how much longer this stuff will be around. Unfortunately, while a lot of this has been preserved, a whole lot more has been lost, and it's a tough thing to see as this is very much an important part of gaming history. Despite that, I have to say I had a lot of fun going through the fan magazines and being transported back nearly 20 years in time, and in many ways, not much has changed. Today, we still talk about the best games to play with emulation based on specific platforms, we still showcase how games perform, and how well certain consoles run based on the device. The only difference being that today we are spoiled by a tremendous amount of options, where back in the day it was really only this and, well, this. I think it's quite obvious that the GeePee32 is an important part of gaming history, and a story for many that goes untold, and I do hope that this episode of Retrospective will shed a small light on this once great handheld. Now for GamePark, its legacy unfortunately ended back in 2007, as the company behind the GeePee32 went bankrupt. But its contributions to gaming are undeniable. For South Korea, it would not be the end of gaming hardware, and a new company would step in and take GamePark's place. But for that, we will have to wait for another episode of Retrospective. But until then, let me know what you think about the GeePee32, and most importantly, did you own one of these handhelds back in the day? As always, I am the Retro Tech Dad, and thank you so much for watching.